I have lived my whole life by sound and scent, by the texture of stone beneath my fingers, and the warmth of sunlight finding my face through a window I cannot see. The pack calls it a gift, the way I move through corridors without faltering, the way I know a person's mood before they speak a single word. I call it survival. There's a difference between the two, though no one in Orlan Hall seems to understand that distinction. The morning of the autumn tribute, I woke to the smell of cedar smoke and wet leaves drifting through my window, and I knew before my maid Ressa even opened her mouth that something had shifted in the air of the house. Tribute days always smelled different, sharper. Like everyone had scrubbed themselves raw to be presentable for a man none of us actually knew. "They say he is arriving before noon," Ressa whispered, fastening the clasp of my cloak at my throat. Her fingers trembled slightly, which told me more than her words did. The Alpha King himself, coming all this way just to collect the harvest tribute. Father says it hasn't happened in 3 generations. I said nothing. What was there to say? I was the blind daughter of a minor pack elder, a girl tucked into back rooms during gatherings, introduced only when manners required it, and forgotten the moment the introduction ended. Kings did not concern themselves with girls like me. I had made peace with that fact long before I had any right to call it peace. My father's voice carried up the stairwell that morning, tight with the particular strain he reserved for important visitors. "Nellie stays in the East Wing today. I won't have her wandering into the courtyard during the ceremony." It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was practiced embarrassment, the kind that had calcified into habit over 22 years. My father loved me the way a man loves a debt he intends to eventually pay off, distantly, dutifully, and always with an eye toward when the obligation might end. My mother had died bringing me into the world already broken, already blind, and some part of him had never forgiven either of us for it. So I sat in the East Wing that morning, listening to the household transform itself into something fit for a king. Servants polished silver until I could hear the squeak of cloth against metal 3 rooms away. Someone dragged furniture across the great hall, the legs scraping a complaint against the floor. My younger cousin Wren ran past my door twice, breathless with excitement, describing in words too fast and too eager exactly what she imagined the king might look like. "They say he's enormous," she gasped, pausing just long enough to grab my hands. "Scarred, too, across his face, from some battle nobody talks about. Lissa from the kitchen saw him 5 years ago at the Ridgemont Summit, and she said just looking at him made her knees go weak." "That sounds more like fear than anything else," I said. Wren laughed, the sound bright and careless in a way I envied. "Maybe it's both." I did not believe, that morning, that I would ever learn the difference for myself. By midday, the house had gone quiet in the particular way that precedes something enormous. I recognized that silence. I had heard it before storms, before funerals, before the rare occasions my father received news that frightened him. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, listening to my own heartbeat, and told myself it had nothing to do with me. I was wrong, though not in the way I expected. It started with Ressa forgetting to latch my door properly when she left to help prepare the hall. A small oversight. An ordinary one. I did not think anything of it until the scent reached me. Pine and rain and something deeper beneath it. Something like the smell of the forest after lightning has split a tree in half. It was unfamiliar and overwhelming, and it was moving closer. I rose without meaning to, my hand finding the wall, my feet carrying me toward the corridor out of pure instinct, the same instinct that had once saved me from walking into an open well as a child. I told myself I only wanted to find Ressa. I told myself a dozen reasonable things. The truth was simpler. Something in the air had called to me, and 22 years of careful invisibility had not prepared me for the pull of it. I rounded the corner from the East Wing into the narrower servants' passage that connected to the great hall. A shortcut I had walked 1,000 times, every stone of it memorized. And that was when I collided with him. It was like walking into a wall that breathed. My hands flew up instinctively, palms pressing against a chest hard as riverstone, and the heat radiating off him was immediate, startling. Nothing like the careful, distant warmth of anyone I had ever touched before. A low sound rumbled somewhere above me, not quite a growl, not quite a question. And the scent of pine and rain and lightning-split wood surrounded me so completely that for one disoriented moment, I forgot to be afraid. Then I remembered exactly who must be standing in that hallway, dressed for a ceremony I had been forbidden to attend, and the fear arrived all at once, flooding through me like cold water. "Forgive me," I breathed, stepping back so quickly I nearly lost my footing. "I didn't hear anyone in the passage. I should have been more careful. You didn't hear me?" His voice was low and rough, carrying the particular texture of a man unused to being surprised by anything. There was no anger in it. That confused me more than anger would have. "I don't see well," I admitted, because lying to a king seemed considerably more dangerous than the truth. "I don't see at all, in fact. I'm sorry. I wasn't told you would be in this part of the house." A long pause followed, long enough that I became acutely aware of my own breathing, of the way my pulse had climbed into my throat. I heard him shift his weight, heard the faint creak of leather, and I imagined, though imagining was all I had, that he was studying me the way one studies something unexpected found in a familiar room. "What is your name?" he asked. "Nellie." It came out smaller than I intended. Another pause. And then, so quietly, I almost mistook it for the wind moving through the corridor, he spoke a single word. Not my name. Not a command. Not anything I expected from a king meeting a stranger in a servant's passage. "Finally." I did not understand it. I did not know what it meant, or why the word seemed to settle into my chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through every part of me that I could not name. I only knew that somewhere down the corridor, I heard the unmistakable sound of someone else's footsteps freeze mid-stride. One of his guards, perhaps. Or an attendant. And the silence that followed was so absolute, it felt like the entire house had stopped breathing along with me. "Your Majesty." The voice belonged to a man, hesitant, clearly startled. "Is everything—" "Leave us," the king said, without turning, without raising his voice at all. And somehow, that quiet command carried more weight than any shout could have. I stood frozen in the corridor, blind to everything except the heat of him still radiating against my skin. And I understood, with the kind of certainty that arrives only a handful of times in a life, that whatever had just happened could not be undone, and that nothing in Orlin Hall would ever return to what it had been before. Word count, 1. 247. I need to extend this block. Let me continue directly into the next beat so we hit the proper range without breaking narrative flow. He did not move away from me, even after his guard's footsteps retreated down the corridor with obvious reluctance. I could hear the man's breathing hitch as he went, could hear the questions he was swallowing, and some small, frightened part of me wanted to call him back. Being alone with the Alpha King in an empty passage felt like standing at the edge of a cliff in the dark. Not knowing the exact distance to the fall made it worse, not better. "You said you don't see well," he said finally. "How do you navigate then? This house is full of corners." "I've lived here my whole life. I know every stone of it." I hesitated, unsure why I was offering him more than the question required. "I count steps. I remember where furniture sits. I listen more than most people bother to." "That's not nothing," he said. "Most men with 2 good eyes walk through life half asleep." I didn't know how to respond to that. No one had ever framed my blindness as anything but a deficiency to be managed, hidden, apologized for. I searched for something to say and found nothing. And into that silence I heard him exhale. Slow, controlled, like a man forcing himself to remain calm. "Your father didn't mention you," he said. "Not once, in any correspondence, in any introduction prepared for today." Shame rose in me, hot and immediate. I'm not usually included. It's easier for everyone that way. Easier for whom? had no answer that wouldn't betray more than I wanted to reveal to a stranger, however powerful, however strange the air around him made me feel. So I said nothing, and the silence stretched between us until I heard him shift again, closer this time, close enough that the warmth of him brushed against my skin like a current. "Nellie," he said, testing the shape of my name in his mouth as though committing it to memory. "I have tributes to collect, treaties to renew, and an entire hall of nobles waiting to flatter me for the next several hours. I find suddenly that I have very little interest in any of it." My heart slammed against my ribs. "Your Majesty, I should return to the East Wing before I'm missed." "You will be missed," he said simply. "I intend to make certain of it." I did not understand what he meant. Not fully, not yet. But I understood enough to know that the quiet, careful, invisible life I had built for myself inside Orlin Hall had just cracked straight down its center, and there would be no gathering the pieces back into their old shape again. The Alpha King did not leave the passage when his guard returned a second time, more insistent now, reminding him in careful, deferential tones that the noble houses had gathered and the tribute could not begin without him. I heard the guard's boots stop a respectful distance away, heard the way his breathing changed when he realized his king had not moved an inch closer to leaving. 5 minutes, Lucian said, and though his voice remained quiet, there was an edge beneath it that silenced any argument before it could form. "Tell them I was delayed." The guard left without another word. I stood there in the corridor, every instinct telling me to retreat to my room and pretend this collision had never happened. And yet my feet refused to obey. Something about the warmth radiating from him, the low and unfamiliar steadiness in his voice, rooted me to that spot more firmly than any command could have. "You should go," I finally managed. "They're waiting for you. I don't want to be the reason—" "You're not the reason for anything yet," he interrupted, though not unkindly. "But I find I'd like you to be." I didn't understand him, not in that moment, and I told myself it didn't matter. Kings spoke in riddles sometimes, especially kings unused to being told no. I reminded myself that whatever strange pull existed between us in that passage was likely nothing more than curiosity on his part. The novelty of a blind girl who hadn't recognized him, who hadn't postured or simpered the way every noble daughter probably had in the hall beyond these walls. "I have duties," he said, and I heard him step back, putting proper distance between us for the first time since we'd collided. "But I will find you again before I leave Orlin Hall. That is not a request, Nellie. It's a promise." Then he was gone, his footsteps fading into the sound of the great hall opening before him. Applause, voices raised in greeting, the particular hush that precedes formal address. I stood alone in the passage for a long moment, my pulse refusing to settle, and when Ressa finally found me there, her voice was sharp with worry. "Nellie, where have you been? Your father is asking." "I'm fine," I said, though I wasn't entirely certain that was true. "I lost track of the passage, that's all." She didn't believe me. I could hear it in the pause before she took my arm and guided me back toward the East Wing, murmuring about how close I'd come to being seen by half the noble houses of the territory. I let her lead me, my mind elsewhere entirely, replaying the rough timbre of his voice, the strange word he'd whispered before his guard had even known to listen. Finally, I turned the word over and over throughout that long afternoon, sitting in my room while the tribute ceremony unfolded somewhere beyond my hearing, muffled by stone and distance. I told myself it meant nothing. Kings were strange, unpredictable creatures, prone to whims that meant everything to them, and nothing to the people swept up in those whims. I had no business hoping otherwise. And yet hope arrived anyway, unbidden and unwelcome, settling into my chest like an ember I couldn't smother. He found me again 3 days later, long after the noble houses had returned to their estates, and the tribute carts had rolled out of Orlin Hall, loaded with grain and silver, and the careful diplomacy of a territory eager to stay in the king's favor. I had assumed by then that his promise in the corridor had been exactly what I feared, a passing curiosity, forgotten the moment something more important demanded his attention. I was wrong. It was early morning when Ressa came to my room, her voice strange with disbelief. "There's a rider from the King's Hall. He's asking for you specifically, by name." My father's reaction, when he learned of it, was a confusion of pride and panic so thick I could practically taste it in the air of the breakfast room. "The king wishes to see Nellie? Are you certain there isn't some mistake?" "No mistake, my lord," the rider said, and I heard the careful neutrality in his tone, the practiced diplomacy of a man delivering a message he didn't fully understand himself. "His Majesty extends an invitation to Lady Nellie to visit the royal grounds, a private audience at her convenience within the fortnight." A private audience. The words settled strangely in the room, and I felt my father's gaze shift toward me, assessing, recalculating, seeing me for the first time in years as something other than an inconvenience to be managed. "Of course," he said quickly. "Of course she'll attend. This is... Nellie, do you understand what an honor this is?" I understood that my father's voice had changed entirely, that the daughter he'd kept hidden in back rooms for 2 decades had suddenly become valuable to him, and the realization left a bitter taste beneath the excitement I couldn't fully suppress. But beneath the bitterness, something else stirred. Something warmer. Something that whispered finally back to me in a voice that wasn't quite my own. The journey to the royal grounds took the better part of a day, and Ressa accompanied me, narrating the changing landscape in low, careful tones as our carriage moved through territory I had never traveled before. Forests gave way to open fields, and the fields eventually gave way to the looming presence of the king's estate. A structure Ressa described as impossibly large, built from pale stone that seemed to glow faintly even in daylight. I felt the change in air the moment we crossed onto royal land. The atmosphere thickened, charged with something I couldn't name, the way storm clouds press down before they break. Servants greeted us with deference that bordered on reverence, and I was led not to a formal receiving room, as I expected, but to a private garden tucked behind the main hall, where the scent of late-blooming roses mixed with something earthier beneath it. "He's already here," Ressa whispered, and I heard the slight hitch in her breath that told me she, too, felt the particular weight of his presence before he ever spoke. "Nellie." His voice came from somewhere ahead, low and warm, carrying none of the formal distance I expected from a king addressing a minor elder's daughter. "You came." "You did say it wasn't a request," I said, and I heard him laugh. A short, surprised sound, as though laughter wasn't something that came easily to him. "I did say that." He moved closer, and I heard Ressa step back discreetly, granting us a privacy I hadn't expected to receive. "Walk with me. There's a path through the garden I think you'll like. It runs along the stream, and the stones are smooth enough that you won't need to count your steps so carefully." It was such a small consideration, and yet it undid something in me that I hadn't realized was still braced and guarded. No one in my life had ever thought to adjust the world around me, rather than expecting me to adjust myself to fit it. We walked for a long while, and he spoke easily of small things at first. The history of the garden, the stream that fed into a larger river beyond the estate, the particular birds that nested in the eaves of the old stone wall. I found myself relaxing, despite every instinct that told me caution was warranted around a man with his kind of power. "Why me?" I finally asked, unable to hold the question back any longer. There must be a dozen noble daughters who would have given anything for an invitation like this. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Because none of them would have told me the truth about not seeing me coming. They would have pretended, performed, calculated every word for advantage. You simply existed in that corridor. That's rarer than you know. That's not much of a reason to summon someone across half the territory." "No," he agreed. "It isn't the whole reason." "Then what is?" He stopped walking, and I felt him turn toward me, felt the weight of his attention settle over me like warmth from a fire I hadn't realized I'd been standing too far from my whole life. "I've ruled this territory for 9 years," he said. "I've sat through 1,000 introductions, 1,000 calculated smiles, 1,000 women positioning themselves to become my queen. I stopped expecting to feel anything in those rooms a long time ago. And in the corridor? In the corridor, he said. I felt something I haven't felt in 9 years. I'd like to understand what that means, if you're willing to let me. The honesty in his voice unsettled me more than any flattery could have. I had spent my whole life being underestimated, overlooked, treated as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. The idea that this man, powerful, scarred, carrying himself with the weight of an entire territory on his shoulders, might want to know me rather than manage me felt almost too foreign to trust. I don't know how to be what people expect of a king's companion, I admitted quietly. I can't see your court, your enemies, the politics moving around us. I'd be a liability before I'd be anything else. You let me worry about that, he said, and there was steel beneath the gentleness now, the voice of a man accustomed to protecting what mattered to him. I haven't asked you to be anything yet, Nellie. I've only asked you to walk beside me in a garden and tell me the truth. You've already done both better than anyone in my court has managed in years. We continued walking, and somewhere beneath the rose-scented air and the sound of the stream beside us, I felt the first fragile threads of something taking root. Something I didn't yet have a name for, something that frightened me precisely because it felt, for the first time in my life, like it might actually be real. The weeks that followed unfolded like nothing I had ever known. Lucian sent for me again before the fortnight ended, and then again after that, until the rhythm of travel between Orlin Hall and the royal estate became something my body learned the way it had once learned the corridors of my childhood home, not through sight, but through repetition, through trust building itself slowly into instinct. My father's attitude toward me transformed with each visit, his pride growing louder and more performative as word spread through the territory that the Alpha King had taken a particular interest in his blind daughter. I heard the change in how the household staff addressed me, the new deference in voices that had once spoken to me with careful, pitying patience. It should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt hollow, a reminder that my worth in their eyes had only ever been contingent on what I might become useful for. Lucian noticed it too, the few times he visited Orlin Hall directly, rather than summoning me to him. Your father speaks of you differently now, he observed one afternoon, as we sat together in the same garden where we'd first walked weeks before. I don't think he means it as a compliment to you. He means it as a compliment to himself, I said. I've simply become more profitable to acknowledge. That won't change, you know. Once people understand what you mean to me, they'll all recalculate. Every smile you receive from now on will carry some measure of self-interest behind it. Is that not true of everyone in your life already? He was quiet for a long moment. Most days, yes. It's part of why the corridor mattered so much. You didn't know who I was. For one brief moment, nothing about how you spoke to me was calculated. I understood, in that admission, something about the loneliness that lived beneath his crown. A loneliness that mirrored my own in ways I hadn't expected. We had both spent years being defined by what others needed from us, rather than who we actually were. He, too large and powerful to ever be approached without agenda. Me, too broken and inconvenient to be approached at all. Somewhere in that strange symmetry, an understanding had taken root that felt less like romance in those early weeks, and more like recognition. Two people who had each been waiting, without knowing it, for someone who simply saw them clearly. It was during one of these visits that I first sensed the resistance gathering around us, subtle at first, like the pressure shift before a storm breaks. I heard it in the careful, measured tones of his advisors, when they didn't realize I was within earshot. I heard it in the new chill that crept into certain noble voices when they greeted me at gatherings I had begun cautiously to attend. The council does not approve, Lucian admitted one evening, when I asked him directly why his chief advisor, a man named Holt, seemed to regard me with such open suspicion. They had hoped I would choose someone from one of the founding bloodlines, someone who could strengthen alliances rather than complicate them. And what do they think I complicate? Everything, he said, with something that might have been wry amusement if it weren't shadowed by genuine concern. A blind companion to the Alpha King raises questions about succession, about whether you could fulfill certain ceremonial duties, about whether enemies might perceive weakness where none exists. Do you believe that? That I'm a weakness? No, he said immediately, firmly, but belief and politics rarely occupy the same room peacefully. I had not fully understood until that conversation the scale of what standing beside him might actually require of me. I had imagined obstacles in vague, abstract terms: disapproval, gossip, the ordinary friction of an unconventional match. I had not imagined a council actively working to undermine my place beside him, nor had I imagined how quickly that opposition might sharpen into something more dangerous than disapproving murmurs. The first real threat arrived disguised as kindness. A noblewoman named Seraphine, daughter of one of the founding bloodline families Lucian's council had hoped he might choose, began appearing at gatherings with increasing frequency. She was, by every account I gathered through tone and texture and the careful descriptions Ressa provided, breathtaking, confident, accomplished, fluent in exactly the kind of court politics that I would never be able to navigate by instinct alone. She's very kind to you, Ressa told me carefully, after one particular gathering at the royal estate. Almost too kind. She asked after your comfort 3 times during the evening, made certain you were never without a chair or a drink. That sounds like genuine consideration. Maybe, Ressa said, though I heard the doubt threaded through her voice. Or maybe it's the kind of consideration designed to be witnessed. The advisor, Holt, was watching the whole time, smiling, in that way that doesn't reach his eyes. I dismissed her concern at first, unwilling to let suspicion poison what little confidence I'd managed to build. But 3 days later, I understood exactly what Ressa had sensed, and I had been too inexperienced to recognize. Seraphine found me alone in the royal gardens, her voice warm, almost sisterly in its gentleness. I think it's remarkable what you've managed, she said. Truly. Most women in your position would have crumbled under this kind of scrutiny. Thank you, I said carefully, uncertain where the conversation intended to go. I only worry for you, she continued. The council is not known for patience, and Lucian, much as he cares for you, has obligations that exist far beyond his own preferences. A king's companion must be able to stand at his side during ceremonies of state, must be able to read treaties before they're signed, must be able to recognize a threat approaching before it ever reaches striking distance. I wonder sometimes whether anyone has been honest with you about the weight of what's truly being asked of you. The words landed with surgical precision, each one designed to plant doubt, exactly where doubt would do the most damage. I felt my carefully built confidence wobble, felt the old, familiar shame of inadequacy creeping back into my chest like a tide I had foolishly believed I'd outrun. Are you saying I'm not capable? I asked, keeping my voice steady through sheer effort of will. I'm saying I don't think anyone has been fair to you about what capability would even require, Seraphine said, her tone never once losing its gentle, sympathetic warmth. I would hate to see you hurt when reality finally arrives. Lucian is not always as protected from the council's pressure as he believes himself to be. She left before I could respond, and I sat alone in the garden for a long while afterward. The scent of roses turned suddenly cloying, the warmth of the afternoon sun doing nothing to thaw the cold settling through my chest. For the first time since the corridor, since the word that had changed everything, doubt crept in fully formed and merciless, whispering that perhaps Seraphine was right, that perhaps love, however real it felt in quiet gardens, would never be enough to withstand the machinery of politics and succession, and a council determined to see me fail. That night, when Lucian visited Orlin Hall unannounced, sensing something had shifted, I found myself unable to voice the doubt sitting heavy in my chest. Instead, I asked him a question I had been avoiding since the very beginning. What happens if the council refuses to accept me? Truly refuses, not just grumbles behind closed doors? His silence stretched long enough that I felt my heart sink before he ever spoke. Then we will face that refusal together, he said finally. But Nellie, I need you to understand something. And I need you to believe it fully, because I suspect someone has been working very hard to make you doubt it. He took my hand, his grip steady and sure. I am not asking you to become someone capable of managing my counsel's approval. I am asking you to remain exactly who you already are, because that is the only thing I have ever actually wanted. It should have settled the doubt entirely. Instead, it only sharpened my awareness of how much remained unresolved, how many forces moved against us in rooms I would never be invited into, how thin the ground beneath this fragile, growing love truly was. I did not yet know that Seraphine's gentle warning in the garden had been only the opening move in something far more deliberate, far more dangerous than wounded pride or political ambition. I did not yet know that within the week, that danger would arrive not as words designed to wound, but as something closer to a blade aimed directly at the fragile trust Lucian and I had only just begun to build. The blade, when it came, arrived in the form of a letter. I learned of it first through the change in the household's atmosphere, a tension that settled over Orlin Hall like fog rolling in from the coast, thick enough that even I, without sight, could feel its weight pressing against every conversation conducted in hushed, careful tones just beyond my hearing. My father's voice, when he finally summoned me to his study 3 days after my last visit with Lucian, carried a coldness I hadn't heard from him in years. A letter arrived from the Royal Council, he said, and I heard paper shifting in his hands, the particular crinkle of expensive parchment being held by someone whose grip had tightened with anxiety. Addressed to me directly. It concerns you. What does it say? It claims, he said carefully, that you have been seen meeting privately with members of a rival pack. That correspondence exists between you and an agent connected to the Thornwood territory. Correspondence that suggests you may have been gathering information about the king's defenses, his travel patterns, the layout of the royal estate. The accusation landed like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs entirely. That's not true. None of that is true. I've never corresponded with anyone from Thornwood. I don't even know anyone there. The letter includes what they claim is evidence, my father continued. And beneath the coldness in his voice, I heard something else now. Fear. The particular fear of a man who understood that his daughter's disgrace might also become his own. A series of letters, signed with your name, describing details about the royal estate that only someone with regular access could have known. Forged, I said, my voice rising despite every effort to remain calm. Someone has forged my hand, or paid someone to write in a style meant to resemble mine. Father, you know me. You know I would never. I know what I've always known, he said, and the words cut deeper than any accusation could have. That I cannot fully account for everything you do when you're away from this house, in rooms and gardens I have no access to, in conversations I cannot verify. The betrayal in that admission settled into my chest like a stone. My own father, faced with a fabricated accusation, found it easier to doubt me than to trust 2 decades of knowing exactly who his daughter was. Within hours, word reached the royal estate, and within a day, Lucian arrived at Orlin Hall himself, his presence filling the house with a tension so thick I could practically taste it. I heard the controlled fury in his voice as he addressed my father in the receiving room, demanding to see the letter, the supposed evidence, every detail of an accusation he refused to accept at face value. This is fabricated, he said, after what felt like an eternity of silence while he examined the documents. The handwriting is close, but not precise. Whoever forged this didn't account for the particular slant Nellie's tutors corrected in her years of practice. More importantly, his voice hardened further. The dates listed correspond to days when Nellie was confirmed to be at the royal estate, in my company, nowhere near positioned to send correspondence to Thornwood agents. Then who would do this? My father asked, though I heard in his voice that he already suspected the answer, and feared what acknowledging it might cost him. Someone who understands exactly how council politics function, Lucian said. Someone with motive to remove Nellie from consideration before this goes any further. He did not name Seraphine directly. Not yet. Not without proof solid enough to withstand the scrutiny such an accusation would invite. But I heard the certainty in his voice, the controlled rage of a man who had already drawn his own conclusions and intended to act on them with the kind of precision that came from 9 years of navigating exactly this sort of danger. What followed was the hardest week of my life since the morning I first understood I would never see the world the way others did. The council, predictably, seized on the accusation with something close to relief, using it as justification to formally request my removal from any further consideration as the king's companion. I was not permitted to attend the council session where the matter would be debated, a decision Lucian fought against and lost, the council citing protocol regarding accused parties and pending investigations. I sat instead in the garden where we had first walked together, Ressa beside me, both of us straining to hear anything carried on the wind from the council chamber on the far side of the estate. "They're saying terrible things," Ressa finally admitted, her voice tight with worry. "Holt is arguing that even if the letters are forged, the mere existence of doubt should be sufficient reason to dissolve the king's interest in you. He's calling it a matter of security, not affection." I felt the ground beneath me shifting in a way that had nothing to do with my blindness, and everything to do with the precariousness of love built across such uneven terrain. Lucian could fight for me in private conversations, could examine forged documents and find their flaws, but against an entire council determined to use any available weapon, I wondered, for the first time, whether his certainty alone would be enough. It was during this period of waiting, this agonizing stretch of days where my fate hung suspended in rooms I couldn't enter, that I made a decision that surprised even myself. I requested an audience with Seraphine directly. She agreed, perhaps curious, perhaps confident enough in her own positioning to believe a confrontation would only further damage my already precarious standing. We met in a smaller garden, away from the main estate, with only Ressa present to describe what I could not see. "I know what you did," I said, without preamble, without the careful diplomatic softening I might have employed weeks earlier, before doubt and fear had stripped away my patience for games. "The letters, the forgery. I don't know how you arranged it, but I know it traces back to you." Silence stretched between us, long enough that I wondered if she intended to deny it outright. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost the warm, sisterly quality from our earlier conversation, replaced by something colder, more honest. "You don't belong in that world," she said. "I'm not saying this to wound you. I'm saying it because it's true. Lucian deserves someone who can stand beside him without requiring constant accommodation, without becoming a vulnerability his enemies can exploit. I did what the council should have done months ago. By lying, by fabricating evidence designed to destroy my reputation, possibly my entire future. By ensuring the right outcome occurs," she said, with chilling calm. "Sometimes the truth needs assistance to arrive where it belongs." I felt something harden in me then, some final remnant of the timid, invisible girl who had spent 22 years accepting whatever role others assigned her. "You're wrong about what I require," I said. "And you're wrong about what makes someone capable of standing beside a king. But you've made one mistake that will undo everything you've built. You assumed I would crumble quietly, the way everyone has always expected me to. I won't." I left her there in the garden, my hands trembling, but my resolve, for the first time in this entire ordeal, absolutely solid. Whatever happened in that council chamber, whatever judgment the elders eventually reached, I would not face it as the frightened, invisible girl I had been in the corridor weeks before. I would face it as someone who had finally learned the shape and weight of her own worth. That evening, Lucian found me in the garden, and I recounted the confrontation in full, watching, through the sudden stillness in his presence, the controlled tension in his breathing, as something in him shifted decisively. "She admitted it," he said quietly. "Outright. To you directly. She didn't expect me to confront her. She expected me to disappear quietly, the way everyone has always assumed I would. She miscalculated badly then. His voice carried something fierce now, protective, and resolved in equal measure. "Tomorrow the council will hear testimony regarding the forged letters. I intend to make certain Seraphine's role in this becomes impossible to dismiss or excuse. And if the council still doesn't accept me, even after the forgery is exposed..." He turned toward me fully, and I felt the weight of his attention settle over me with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "Then the council will need to accustom itself to disappointment," he said, "because I have made my choice, Nellie, and it was never contingent on their approval. It was only ever contingent on you. For the first time since the letter arrived, I allowed myself to believe that this fragile, hard-won love might actually survive the machinery determined to destroy it. But I also understood, with the same clarity that had once told me exactly where the well's edge sat in my childhood garden, that tomorrow's council session would determine far more than my standing at court. It would determine whether love, however genuine, could ever truly triumph over the cold calculations of power. The council chamber was a room I had never entered, though I had heard it described countless times in the weeks since Lucian's interest in me became public knowledge. Vast, formal, lined with the portraits of alphas who had ruled this territory for generations before him. I stood at its threshold the following morning, Ressa's hand steady beneath my elbow, and felt the weight of dozens of eyes settling on me the moment the doors opened. Lucian had insisted, against considerable protest from Holt and several other council members, that I be present for the testimony. "If her future is to be decided in this room," he had said, in a tone that ended further argument, "then she will hear every word spoken about her, rather than receiving second-hand accounts of judgments made in her absence." I was guided to a seat near the front, close enough to hear every shift of fabric, every cleared throat, every carefully measured breath the council members took as the proceedings began. Holt's voice opened the session, formal and clipped, outlining the accusations against me with the same cold precision he'd apparently employed throughout the entire ordeal. Then Lucian spoke, and the chamber's atmosphere shifted entirely. He laid out, methodically, and without a trace of the emotion I knew was simmering beneath his composure, every flaw in the forged letters, the inconsistencies in handwriting that a trained scribe confirmed under oath, the travel records proving I had been at the royal estate during every date the letters claimed otherwise, the testimony of 3 separate household members who confirmed my whereabouts during the period in question. And then came the testimony I hadn't expected. A young scribe, nervous and clearly terrified of the room's weight, stepped forward to admit that she had been approached weeks earlier by a woman matching Seraphine's description, offered a substantial sum to produce documents in a hand resembling mine. She had agreed, she admitted, not fully understanding the purpose, and had only come forward once guilt and fear of discovery outweighed her fear of the consequences. The chamber erupted into murmurs, and I heard Seraphine's composure crack for the first time. A sharp intake of breath, the scrape of a chair as she rose to deny the accusation, her voice climbing toward something close to panic as the careful, calculated control she'd maintained throughout this entire scheme finally abandoned her. "This is absurd," she said. "I've done nothing but advocate for the stability of this territory. By forging documents intended to destroy an innocent woman's reputation?" Lucian's voice cut through hers with quiet, devastating precision. "By manipulating a frightened young scribe into committing fraud on your behalf? I wonder, Seraphine, how the council intends to reconcile your concerns about stability with evidence of exactly the kind of deception that would actually threaten it." The session that followed stretched for hours, filled with debate I could only partially follow, voices rising and falling around accusations and counter-accusations, procedural questions about punishment and precedent. But beneath all of it, I felt something fundamental had already shifted, not because the council had necessarily embraced me, but because the foundation of their objection had crumbled entirely, exposed as nothing more than manufactured doubt designed to serve one woman's ambition. By the time the council formally withdrew Seraphine's family from consideration for any future alliance, and quietly noted that no further objection would be raised regarding the king's personal choices, I understood that we had won something far larger than a single contested ruling. We had survived the machinery that had been built specifically to destroy us, and we had survived it intact. The weeks that followed brought a quiet I hadn't experienced since long before the autumn tribute changed the entire course of my life. My father, chastened by his own willingness to doubt me so readily, attempted clumsy gestures of reconciliation that I accepted with cautious, measured grace. Not because I had fully forgiven the years of careful invisibility he'd imposed on me, but because I had learned, through everything that transpired, that holding on to bitterness cost more than it ever returned. Seraphine disappeared from court entirely. Her family's influence diminished. Her ambitions for that particular kind of power closed off permanently. I felt no satisfaction in her downfall, only a quiet relief that the threat she'd posed had finally been neutralized. Lucian and I continued walking the garden path along the stream, though our conversations had changed in texture, deepened by everything we'd survived together. He told me, one evening as autumn gave way fully to winter's first frost, that he intended to formalize our bond before the full council and the gathered nobility of the territory. Not as a private arrangement quietly tolerated, but as a public declaration that would leave no further room for doubt or manipulation. "Are you certain?" I asked him, though by then the question felt more like ritual than genuine uncertainty. "Once this becomes formal, there will be no retreating from it. Every eye in the territory will be watching." "I've spent 9 years being watched by eyes that expected nothing genuine from me," he said. "I find I no longer fear being watched, as long as what they witness is real." The ceremony, when it came, was smaller than the grand spectacles I'd heard described in stories of royal unions past. Lucian had insisted on that, understanding instinctively that I would have been overwhelmed by the kind of overwhelming pageantry typically reserved for such occasions. Instead, it took place in the same garden where we'd first walked together, where roses had bloomed and later withered and would, come spring, bloom again. I could not see the faces gathered around us that day, could not see the expression on Lucian's face as he spoke the words that bound us formally before his people. But I felt the warmth of the sun against my skin, felt Ressa's hand squeezing mine with quiet joy, just before she stepped back to let the ceremony proceed, felt my father's presence nearby, subdued, and finally perhaps, genuinely proud rather than merely calculating. And I felt Lucian's hand find mine, steady and certain, exactly as it had been every day since that collision in the corridor months before. "I once told you that meeting you was the first true thing I'd felt in 9 years, he said, his voice low enough that the words felt meant only for me, despite the gathered crowd. "I find that feeling has only grown since. You didn't just survive everything thrown against us, Nellie. You taught an entire territory what strength actually looks like, even when it doesn't resemble what they expected." "I couldn't see any of it," I said softly. "Not the council, not Seraphine's schemes, not even your face right now, as you say this." "You didn't need to see it," he said. "You felt it clearly enough to navigate through all of it anyway. That's rarer than sight, Nellie. That's something I don't think most people, with all their vision intact, ever actually manage to find." The territory, in the months following our union, settled into a new rhythm. I never gained the ability to read treaties myself, never gained sight that would let me recognize approaching threats the way Seraphine had once insisted was necessary. But I learned instead to trust the instincts that had carried me safely through 22 years of darkness, learned to lean on Ressa's careful descriptions and Lucian's steady presence beside me, learned that capability had never required vision in the way the council had once insisted. I became, in time, exactly the kind of companion the council had once doubted I could be, not despite my blindness, but because of everything that blindness had taught me about listening, about patience, about recognizing truth beneath the surface of careful, calculated words. Nobles who had once regarded me with suspicion learned, gradually, to value the particular clarity I brought to court, an ear for deception that no amount of sight could have taught me, a steadiness that came from having spent a lifetime navigating a world that never once made accommodations for me. On quiet evenings, long after the formal ceremonies and political maneuvering had settled into the comfortable rhythm of an established life, Lucian and I would walk the garden path together, and he would describe to me, In patient detail, the way the light fell across the stream, the particular shade the roses turned as autumn approached again, the small, ordinary beauties of a world I would never see, but had in every way that mattered, finally found my place within. The girl who once bumped into a king in a darkened corridor, invisible and overlooked by her own family, had become something far more enduring than anyone in that corridor could have predicted. Not a queen defined by what she lacked, but a woman whose strength had been there all along, simply waiting for someone willing to see it clearly, even in the dark.